The morning Phineas Talbot rode out to survey the damage, he did not expect to find half the valley already moving. He stood in his stirrups, one hand gripping the saddle horn, the other shading his eyes against the pale October sun, and what he saw made his breath stop cold in his chest. Wagons, at least a dozen of them, rolling across his east field with their wheels cutting deep furrows into the frost-hardened earth. Men he barely recognized were walking between the rows of unharvested wheat, their arms swinging in the rhythm of experienced workers. Women carried water buckets down from the creek. Children ran between the legs of workhorses, keeping them calm. And standing in the dead center of all of it, a red wool coat burning against the gray morning sky like a signal fire, was Maggie Redmond. She had a notebook pressed open against her forearm, a pencil behind her ear, and she was pointing directions at 3 different men simultaneously, her voice carrying clean and clear across the October wind. Phineas could not move. He had been told she was bold. He had been told she had opinions that could fill a courthouse. He had been told by half the men in Millhaven County that Maggie Redmond was more trouble than any decent man ought to want. He had believed all of it. He had kept his distance. And now she had organized his entire valley without asking him a single word about it. The betrayal hit him like cold water. His jaw tightened. His horse shifted beneath him, reading the sudden tension in his body, because this was his land, his harvest, his problem to solve or to lose. He had not asked for charity. He had not asked for rescue. He had not asked for Maggie Redmond to come riding in on the wings of her relentless generosity and take the reins out of his hands like he was some broken-down thing too helpless to manage his own ruin. He nudged his horse forward, and his voice came out harder than he intended. "What in God's name is going on here?" She turned at the sound of his voice. Something moved across her face. Not guilt, not apology. Something closer to steeling herself, bracing for exactly this reaction, because she had known it was coming and she had organized the entire valley anyway. "Good morning, Phineas," she said. That was the moment everything changed, not because she said his name with any particular warmth, but because she said it like she had earned the right to, like she had already decided what this day was going to be, and his temper was simply one more thing on her list to manage. He did not know it yet. Standing there in his stirrups with the cold October light on his face and the sound of 20 people working his harvest all around him, Phineas Talbot did not yet understand that the force arriving in the shape of Maggie Redmond was not a betrayal at all. It was the beginning of everything he had ever secretly wanted and never once believed he deserved. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how Phineas came to be standing in a field watching a woman reorganize his entire world, you have to go back 3 weeks, to the night the temperature dropped without warning, and the first real threat of an early frost crept in from the northern mountains like a secret no one had wanted to speak out loud. Millhaven, Montana, 1887. The Northern Pacific Railroad had come through 6 years earlier, and with it had come a wave of settlers who turned the valley floor into a patchwork of wheat fields and cattle ranges stretching from the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains all the way east toward the Yellowstone. It was beautiful country. It was also unforgiving country. The growing season sat in a narrow window between late spring mud and early autumn frost, and every farmer in the valley lived the whole summer with one eye on the sky and one hand pressed to the ground, feeling for the temperature change that could come 4 weeks early and strip a man of everything he had worked for since April. Phineas Talbot had come to Millhaven in 1882 with $160, a box of tools, and a stubbornness that had served him well in some respects and badly in others. He had filed a homestead claim on 320 acres along the eastern slope of the valley, where the soil ran deep and dark, and the spring snowmelt fed a small creek that kept the land green well into July. He had built his own house with timber he hauled himself from the ridge. He had broken the ground himself with a team of 2 horses and a borrowed plow. He had planted his first crop alone and watched it fail due to late planting, and he had planted his second crop alone and watched it fail due to flooding, and he had planted his third crop and watched it come in golden and full and beautiful, and he had stood in the middle of it with tears he would never acknowledge running freely down his face. He was 31 years old in the autumn of 1887. He had no wife. He had no family within 500 miles. He had his land, his crop, his horses, and a reputation in Millhaven as a man who kept his word, worked without complaint, and did not need anyone's help. That reputation was about to become a trap. The third week of October, a man named Burl Oakes rode through the valley on his way south from Billings and stopped at the Millhaven General Store with news from the northern weather stations. The temperature up at the Blackfoot Agency had already dropped to 19 degrees. The plains north of the Missouri were showing frost in the mornings. Every experienced farmer in the valley knew what that meant. The cold front was moving faster than expected. They had perhaps 10 days, perhaps fewer, before the first killing frost arrived in the lower valley. Any wheat still standing in the fields would be lost. Phineas had been listening from the back of the store. He had set down the roll of fence wire he was buying and walked out without a word. He stood in the street for a long moment, counting in his head. He had 300 acres of wheat. He had one hired hand, a 19-year-old boy named Chester, who had broken his collarbone 2 weeks earlier falling off a wagon. He had 2 horses. He had one mechanical reaper that needed a new belt he had ordered from St. Louis that had not yet arrived. He was going to lose everything. He had stood in that street in Millhaven, with the cold October wind coming down from the mountains, and he had run the numbers 6 different ways in his head, and every single calculation had come out the same. Even if he worked from before dawn until after dark every single day, he could not get that harvest in alone. Not in time, not without the reaper belt, not without help. The word lodged in his chest like a splinter. Help. Phineas Talbot had not asked anyone for help since he was 7 years old, and his father had told him that asking for help was the same thing as announcing to the world that you were not enough. His father had been a hard and not particularly wise man, but that particular piece of cruelty had gone in deep, and 24 years of stubborn survival had only cemented it further. He had built his farm alone. He had weathered drought alone. He had buried his first 2 crops alone. The idea of walking into the Millhaven saloon or the general store and saying out loud that Phineas Talbot could not manage his own harvest was something that felt very close to dying. So he did not say it. He went home. He assessed his reaper for what he could repair without the missing belt. He sharpened every blade he owned. He laid out his plan for working the sections in order of priority, starting with the fullest fields, and he told himself that he would do what he could do, and he would not think about what he could not. He did not sleep much that first night. Maggie Redmond had been in Millhaven for 2 years. She had arrived in September of 1885. The only daughter of a Missouri schoolteacher who had died the previous spring, and left her with a small amount of money, a wagon, and the absolute conviction that she was not going to spend the rest of her life in a city where the air smelled of coal smoke and obligation. She had filed her own homestead claim, 40 acres on the western edge of the valley near the river, and she had turned it into a market garden that supplied most of Millhaven's families with vegetables through the summer and preserved goods through the winter. She was 27 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned up while she worked and let loose in the evenings when she sat on her porch reading. She had green eyes that saw things other people missed. She had hands that were permanently calloused from work, and she did not apologize for them. She was quick-tempered in response to injustice and patient in response to almost everything else, and she had a particular gift for looking at a complicated problem and seeing immediately what needed to happen to solve it. What Millhaven knew about Maggie Redmond was that she ran the Community Vegetable Cooperative that had helped 4 families survive the previous winter when the cattle prices collapsed. What Millhaven also knew about Maggie Redmond was that she had refused 2 marriage proposals in her first year in the valley. One from a cattle rancher named Estes, who drank too much, and one from a banker in town named Fowler, who did not drink at all, but had a way of looking at her land with more interest than he looked at her. She had refused them both politely and without apparent regret, and the town had decided she was either particular or proud or both, and they respected her for it while also speculating endlessly about what it would take to change her mind. What almost nobody knew about Maggie Redmond was what had happened in Kansas City 2 years before she came west. There was a man there, a man she had loved the way young women love when they have not yet learned what the cost of that kind of love can be. His name was Daniel Forsyth, and he had taken her trust and her time and a significant piece of her heart, and he had handed all of it over to his own ambition without a second glance. She had not been ruined in any dramatic sense. She had simply been taught something very specific about what it felt like to be useful to someone who did not actually value you, and that lesson had settled into her bones and made her careful in a way she had not been before. She was careful about Phineas Talbot in particular. She had noticed him the way you notice weather, unavoidably. From a distance at first, in the way he moved around the Millhaven General Store, always deliberate, always contained, always just slightly apart from the groups of men who gathered to talk. She had asked about him and received the standard Valley biography. Good farmer, hard worker, kept to himself. She had filed this information and returned to her own business. Then, in July of that summer, her fence line along the south side of her property had collapsed under the weight of a fallen cottonwood tree, and by the time she had gotten out to look at it in the morning, the breach had already been repaired. The tree had been cut and moved. The fence posts had been reset. The wire had been restrung. She had asked around and eventually established that Phineas Talbot, riding home from town the previous evening, had seen the damage and spent 2 hours in the dark fixing it without leaving his name or waiting for thanks. She had thought about that for a long time. She had thought about the fact that a man who would do that kind of thing in the dark and ride away without acknowledgement was either genuinely modest or genuinely lonely, and she had not been able to decide which one it was, and the uncertainty had made her think about him more than she wanted to. She tried to thank him the following Sunday at the community meeting at the Millhaven schoolhouse. He had gone red across the cheekbones in a way that was entirely at odds with the controlled, self-sufficient image he presented to the world, and he had said it was nothing, just a matter of seeing something that needed doing, and he had looked at a point somewhere over her left shoulder for the duration of the conversation, as if direct eye contact with her presented some kind of structural danger. She had found this extraordinarily interesting. She had also found him extraordinarily handsome in a way she tried not to dwell on, because handsome was not the same as trustworthy, and she had the scar tissue to prove it. He was tall and lean in the manner of men who work hard and eat plainly, with brown hair that needed cutting and dark eyes that were considerably warmer than his expression usually suggested. He had a good jaw. He had hands that looked like they could do anything. She had noticed his hands with a specificity that embarrassed her slightly, and she had firmly directed her attention elsewhere. They had not spoken much after that. A nod at the general store. A brief exchange at the schoolhouse meeting in September about the Valley Road needing repair before winter. Polite, reserved, careful. The kind of proximity that happens between 2 people who are both, for their own private reasons, maintaining a safe distance from something that pulls at them. And then Burl Oakes had ridden through with his news about the early frost. Maggie had been in the general store that same afternoon. She had heard the whole conversation. She had watched Phineas Talbot set down his fence wire and walk out without speaking, and she had watched his face in the moment before he turned, and she had seen something there that was not stoicism. It was a man looking at catastrophe and choosing not to show it, which was entirely different, and the distinction had lodged in her chest and refused to leave. She had gone home that evening and stood on her porch looking out across the valley with the cold coming in off the mountains, and she had thought about what 300 acres of unharvested wheat meant in practical terms. She had thought about the hours. She had thought about the machines and the men required. She had thought about Chester's broken collarbone and the missing reaper belt, and the horse team that could not pull a loaded wagon and the reaper at the same time. And then she had done something that came so naturally to her that she did not even recognize it as remarkable. She had gotten out her notebook. She had started writing down names, families in the valley who had labor to spare, men who had machinery sitting idle after their own harvests were done, women who could bring food and water to keep workers in the field longer. She had mapped the valley in her head and calculated which farms had already come in and which had not, and she had worked through the arithmetic of what could be mobilized, how quickly, and in what order. By midnight she had a plan. By the following morning she was riding. She went first to the Hodgen farm, 3 miles north, where Lars Hodgen and his 2 grown sons had finished their own harvest a week early, and their machinery sat in the barn with nothing to do. Lars was a practical Norwegian man who had been in the valley since 1879, and who had a deeply personal understanding of what early frost could do to a man's year. He had listened to Maggie's proposal for approximately 4 minutes before he had started nodding and gone to find his sons. She went next to the Corrigan family on the River Road, where James Corrigan had a thrashing machine and a grudging respect for Maggie's vegetable cooperative that had kept his family in root vegetables through the previous February. James needed some persuading because he was not a man who gave his machinery or his time lightly, but Maggie had his full agreement within 20 minutes, partly by appealing to Valley solidarity and partly by pointing out that if Talbot's harvest failed, one of the finest wheat operations in the valley would be severely weakened, which would affect grain prices and communal resources for everyone. She went to the Swanson family, who had 4 strong daughters in addition to 2 sons and who were the most efficient workers in the valley. She went to the widower McAllister, who had horses to spare. She went to the schoolteacher's wife, Clara Hastings, who organized the community Christmas dinner every year with the efficiency of a military campaign, and who immediately understood what Maggie was building and signed on with an enthusiasm that was deeply satisfying. She went to the Cree community on the eastern edge of the valley, where a man named Thomas Bird kept a small farm and had quietly been part of the Millhaven community for years in a way that most people acknowledged only when they needed something. Thomas Bird had heard Maggie out and then asked her one direct question. Was Phineas Talbot the kind of man who would accept help from a Cree family without making them feel the indignity of it? Maggie had looked Thomas Bird in the eye and said she believed he was. Thomas Bird had considered this answer for a long moment and then said that he and his brother would be there with their team. She had gone to 11 households in 2 days. She had not gone to Phineas Talbot. This was deliberate. This was the part that Phineas, standing in his field on that October morning with fury rising in his chest, was going to misunderstand completely before he understood it correctly. She had not gone to him because going to him first would have given him the opportunity to refuse. And she had known, with a certainty that came from paying careful attention to who he was, that he would refuse. He would have thanked her for the thought and told her he had it under control, and she would have watched him lose everything he had built out of pure stubborn pride while she stood on the outside of it, helpless. She had not been willing to let that happen, so she had organized the valley first and planned to explain later. She understood this was a risk. She understood he was going to be angry. She had spent 2 days preparing her arguments and steeling herself for the reaction, and when he came riding across that field on his gray horse with his jaw set and his dark eyes burning, she had felt the full weight of what she had done land on her simultaneously with the knowledge that she would do it again. "What in God's name is going on here?" he said, and his voice carried the specific quality of a man who is very angry and is holding the anger on a short leash because there are other people present. "Good morning, Phineas," she said. She watched him take that in. She watched him look out across his own field where a dozen people were already cutting wheat in organized rows, where Lars Hodgen's son was driving the team in clean passes, where the Corrigan thresher was being set up at the field's edge by three men who knew exactly what they were doing. She watched something work its way through his expression that was more complicated than pure anger. She gave him a moment with it. "You had no right," he said at last. "I know," she said. "This is my land, my harvest, my business." "Yes," she said, "it is." "Then why are there 14 people on my property that I did not invite?" "Because the frost is coming in 6 days," she said. "I checked this morning. I spoke with the blacksmith who has a barometer from back east. 6 days, Phineas, maybe 5. And you have 300 acres of standing wheat and one farmhand with a broken collarbone and a reaper that won't run without a belt that isn't here yet." He stared at her. "I am not a charity case," he said, and his voice had gone quieter, which she recognized as more dangerous. "No," she said evenly. "You are a man in a difficult situation that you did not cause and cannot resolve alone, and there is nothing shameful about that. 14 people came out this morning because they chose to." Lars Hodgen remembered 1881 when he lost his entire winter barley, and nobody came to help him because nobody had organized it yet. James Corrigan is here because last January your grain kept 3 Valley families from going short. Thomas Bird is here because I asked him, and because he is a good man who has been a part of this community as long as any of us, whether or not everyone always acts like it. Phineas looked across his field. He looked at Thomas Bird, who was working a section of wheat with his brother with the quiet efficiency of a man who has been underestimated his whole life and has decided not to waste energy being bothered by it. Something shifted in Phineas's face. "I don't know how to thank people for something I didn't ask for," he said, and it came out more honest than he had intended. "You don't have to thank them yet," Maggie said. "You have to help them. Get off your horse and get into that field and work beside them. That is the thanks they came for." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was coming sideways through the mountains now, and it caught the gold in her hair where it had come loose at her temple, and her green eyes were direct and steady and completely unintimidated by his displeasure. He had the sudden and disorienting sensation of being seen very clearly by someone who was not afraid of what they saw. He dismounted. He looped his reins over the fence post and took off his coat and rolled up his sleeves and walked into his own field. He did not say another word to her for 3 hours. The work was extraordinary. Maggie had organized it with a precision that, once he stopped being furious about it, Phineas could not help but admire. She had arranged the teams in rotating sections so that no one person exhausted themselves on a single continuous stretch. She had positioned the Corrigan thresher at optimal intervals to keep up with the cutting pace. She had arranged for Clara Hastings and 2 other women to run a food and water rotation that kept everyone fueled and moving. She had even somehow managed to send word to the blacksmith in town about the reaper belt, and by 10 o'clock in the morning, a rider arrived with a replacement belt that had been sitting in the back of a supply crate for 3 months waiting to be claimed. Phineas stopped working long enough to stare at the belt in the rider's hands. "How did she know about this?" he asked. The rider, a boy of about 16, shrugged with the disinterest of youth. "Miss Redmond asked Mr. Beaumont to check his inventory this morning," he said. "He found it in 20 minutes, said he should have thought to mention it sooner." Phineas stood very still for a moment. Then he took the belt and went to his reaper. By noon they had covered 40 acres. By 3 in the afternoon, with the reaper now running properly, they had covered 80. The wheat came in golden and full, exactly the crop he had spent all summer nurturing, and watching it come in with this strange assembled community working around him was one of the most complicated experiences of Phineas Talbot's adult life. He had expected the help to feel humiliating. It did not feel humiliating. It felt like something he did not have a good word for, something warm and slightly frightening that he had no established defenses against. He kept watching Maggie. She was everywhere. She moved from section to section with her notebook, making adjustments, solving small problems before they became large ones, mediating a brief dispute between James Corrigan and Lars Hodgen about the optimal approach angle for the thresher with a deft, good-humored confidence that had both men laughing within 5 minutes. She carried water buckets. She helped stack sheaves. She was not above any of it, and the people around her could feel that, and they worked harder because of it. Around 4 in the afternoon, Phineas found himself working alongside Thomas Bird in one of the far sections. They worked in silence for a while, which was not uncomfortable. "You know her from before?" Phineas asked eventually, meaning before today. Thomas Bird glanced at him. "I know of her. She has a fair reputation." "She does," Phineas said. He was quiet for a moment. "She didn't tell me she was going to do this." "No," Thomas Bird said. "I expect she knew you would have stopped her." Phineas did not have an answer for that. "My family has been in this valley since before any of this was anyone's homestead claim," Thomas Bird said, without bitterness, simply as a fact that he was choosing to share. "People ask us for help when they need it, and they forget about us the rest of the time. That is the way it goes. But your Miss Redmond asked us the way you ask people you actually respect. That is rarer than it should be." "She is not my Miss Redmond," Phineas said. Thomas Bird made a sound that might have been a laugh. "No," he agreed. "She does not strike me as being anyone's anything, which is probably why she is interesting." Phineas cut 4 more rows of wheat before he said, very quietly, "Yes." At dusk, when the light had gone amber and the temperature was dropping fast, Maggie called a pause for the evening. The day's work was tallied, and it was remarkable. They had brought in 160 acres of wheat, more than half the total crop, in one day. With 2 more days of work at this pace, with the full team returning, they would have the entire harvest in before the frost arrived. People gathered at the edge of the field. Clara Hastings had somehow produced a meal from what seemed to be pure organizational willpower, and there were pots of bean stew and cornbread and coffee, and the assembled workers stood and sat in the cold October dusk eating together. The mood was satisfied and a little exhausted and entirely warm, the mood of people who have done something real together and feel good about it. Phineas stood at the edge of the gathering with his bowl of stew, and he looked at all of these people who had come to work his land today, and he felt something move through him that he was not equipped to name. Maggie appeared at his elbow. "Eat," she said. "I am eating," he said. She stood beside him. They looked out over the darkening field. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "For this morning I was rude." "You were surprised," she said. "I was both," he said. "I am sorry for the rude part." She was quiet for a moment. "I understand why. I made a decision about your property without consulting you, which was not my right to do. I did it because I believed you would refuse help if I gave you the chance to, and because I did not want to watch you lose this harvest over a question of pride. But I understand why that felt like a violation, so I apologize for that part as well." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the field, her profile clean against the darkening sky, and there was a quality of honesty in what she had just said that he was not used to receiving from anyone. Most people, in his experience, either apologized for everything or for nothing. This specific calibration, this precise ownership of what she had done wrong without surrendering the justification for it, was something different. "How did you know I would refuse?" he asked. She glanced at him. "Because you fixed my fence in the dark and rode away without leaving your name," she said. He stared at her. "People who do things for others without wanting acknowledgement usually have a corresponding difficulty accepting things done for them," she said. "It is the same impulse, just in the other direction." He looked away. He looked at the darkening sky and the last of the golden stubble visible in the fields and the oil lamps that people were beginning to light. He felt entirely seen in a way that was both wonderful and deeply uncomfortable. "I am not sure whether to be impressed or unsettled," he said. "You can be both," she said, and there was warmth in her voice now, something that had not been there in the morning's tense exchange. And when he looked at her, she was not quite smiling, but she was close to it. He wanted very badly to say something that was equal to the moment. He could not find the words. He was a man who had spent years being competent with his hands and largely silent with his heart, and the specific vocabulary required for this kind of conversation was rusty in him from disuse. What he said was, "Will they come back tomorrow?" "Yes," she said. "I have already spoken with Lars and James. The whole crew returns at dawn." He nodded. He looked at his stew. Then he looked at her. "Then you will be here tomorrow," he said. "If you want me to be," she said. There was a pause. It was not a comfortable pause exactly, but it was a charged one, the kind that happens when two careful people are standing on the edge of something and both of them know it. "Yes," he said. "I want you to be." She held his gaze for one long moment. Then she nodded and walked away to help Clara gather the empty dishes, and Phineas stood in his field in the cold dusk and understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of exhaustion and relief, that he was in a great deal of trouble. The second day was different, not in efficiency. In efficiency, the second day was nearly as remarkable as the first, with the full team returning at dawn and the reaper running smoothly on its new belt, and the weather holding cold but dry. The second day was different because the initial shock and friction had worn off, and what remained was something warmer and stranger and more interesting. Phineas worked. He worked harder than he had worked in years, which was saying something for a man who had built his farm with his own hands. He drove the team, he operated the reaper, he stacked sheaves and directed traffic and generally made himself as useful as possible, and the physical exhaustion was clean and good and satisfying in a way that solitary work had not been for a long time. There was something about working alongside people he was rediscovering that made the work feel different, more alive, and he kept watching Maggie. He watched her negotiate with a quietly stubborn James Corrigan about the thresher positioning with a diplomatic skill that should have been obvious from the beginning, but which she made look effortless. He watched her sit down in the dirt beside one of the Swanson daughters, a girl of about 18 who had twisted her ankle on a rock, and look at the ankle with careful hands and determine it was not broken and rig a binding from her neckerchief that allowed the girl to keep working. He watched her find Thomas Bird's brother's broken harness strap at noon and repair it with a length of leather cord she produced from her coat pocket, as if she had been waiting all morning for exactly this problem. He watched her laugh. That was the part that undid him. She laughed with her whole face, with her eyes and her voice together, at something Lars Hodgen's oldest son said, and it was a sound like water over rocks, clear and unguarded and entirely genuine, and it reached across the cold October field and did something to Phineas Talbot's chest that he did not have a good defense against. He looked away quickly. Lars Hodgen's oldest son was a perfectly nice young man named Eric, who was probably 23 years old and who had been making Maggie laugh at intervals throughout the morning. Phineas was not going to examine why he had noticed this. In the late afternoon, there was a crisis. The thresher's main drive belt cracked under the strain of the continuous work, a thick leather belt that could not be repaired in the field and for which there was no immediate replacement in the valley. The thresher stopped. Without it, the cut wheat could not be separated from the stalks, and without that separation, the grain could not be stored, and the whole operation became significantly less useful. James Corrigan stood looking at the broken belt with the expression of a man who has been betrayed by a piece of machinery he should have checked more carefully. The gathered workers stood around in the uncomfortable way of people whose rhythm has been broken. Maggie appeared with her notebook. "The Peterson farm," she said. Everyone looked at her. "Carl Peterson has a thresher he bought 2 years ago that he has never actually used properly. He bought it from a catalog and he has the spare parts sitting in his barn. He mentioned it at the community meeting in August and I wrote it down. I will ride there now." "Peterson won't give you his spare parts," James Corrigan said. "Carl Peterson doesn't give anyone anything." "He might give them to me," Maggie said, and the way she said it was not boastful. It was simply the observation of a woman who understood people and their motivations in a practical way. She rode to the Peterson farm, and she was back in an hour and a half with a replacement belt, and also, improbably, Carl Peterson himself, who had apparently been persuaded to come and see what a properly organized community harvest looked like. Carl Peterson was a sour and self-sufficient man who had the reputation of the most isolated farmer in the valley, and watching him climb down from his wagon and stand with his arms crossed watching the operation with something that was gradually becoming interest was one of the more remarkable things Phineas Talbot had seen in several years. "What did you say to him?" Phineas asked her when she rode back up beside him. "I told him that the valley was organizing its labor this way more and more, and that any farmer who participated in the cooperative effort would be able to call on it when they needed it, and that given the age of his east barn roof, he might want to build some goodwill now." She paused. "I also told him I would bring him preserved cherry jam for Christmas." Phineas stared at her. "The cherry jam was probably what sealed it," she said. He started laughing. He had not meant to. It came out without his permission, a genuine laugh that surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her, and she turned to look at him with such unguarded delight at the sound of it that he had to look away before he said something he was not ready to say. On the evening of the second day, with the harvest almost finished and the cold coming down hard off the mountains, Maggie organized a brief meeting of all the workers at the edge of the field. She went through the third day's plan with the efficiency and clarity that had apparently characterized her entire operation from the beginning. She reassigned teams based on what sections remained. She adjusted the reaper's route to maximize the final hours. She outlined a contingency plan if the temperature dropped overnight and the ground became too hard for the team. When she was done, Lars Hodgen started to clap. It was not a sarcastic gesture. It was a genuine expression of appreciation from a man who had been farming this valley for 8 years and had never seen anything organized with that level of care. The others joined in, and the sound of it carried across the cold, dark field, and Maggie's face did something complicated and beautiful, a mixture of pleasure and embarrassment that made her look younger than her 27 years. Phineas did not clap. He stood very still at the back of the gathering and felt the force of what she was like move through him again, and he understood clearly and painfully that whatever distance he had been maintaining between himself and this feeling was essentially gone. He had not had a serious relationship since he came west. There had been a woman in Bozeman, 5 years back, who had seemed promising for about 3 months before it became apparent that she was interested in his land rather than in him, and the experience had confirmed his general suspicion that he was better off alone. He had been alone so long that the loneliness had become invisible, the way you stop seeing furniture in a room you live in every day. He had forgotten it was there. Maggie was reminding him that it was there. He found her after the meeting, when most of the workers had begun to disperse toward their wagons and horses. She was standing near the fence looking up at the sky, reading the clouds the way people who live close to the land learn to do. "Clear night," she said when he stopped beside her. "Temperature will hold, good news for tomorrow." "Yes," he said, a pause. "I owe you something I cannot repay," he said. "You owe me nothing," she said. "I owe you honesty then," he said. "Which is that this morning when I rode out and found all of this, my first reaction was anger, not gratitude, anger, because I have spent a very long time believing that the measure of a man is what he can do alone, and you arrived and changed the terms of that in about 4 minutes, and that was difficult." She was quiet, looking at the sky. "My father was the kind of man who equated needing help with failure," he said. "I know that is not a noble or an interesting story. Every other man in the West has a version of it. But I want you to know that when I say thank you, it means more than the words normally carry, because it cost me something to get to the place of meaning it." She turned to look at him. The moonlight was coming out between the clouds, and it caught the green of her eyes, and she looked at him with a directness that he had come to recognize as her characteristic mode. My father was the kind of man who told me that a woman's best skill was knowing which things to manage quietly and which things to ask for, she said. He meant it kindly, but what I understood from it was that my instincts and my intelligence were acceptable only insofar as I hid them. It took me a long time to stop doing that. She paused. I am telling you this so that you understand what it meant for me to ride across this valley for 2 days asking people for things they could have refused. I was raised to believe that kind of boldness was not ladylike. I have spent years deciding it is necessary. He looked at her for a long moment. The night was very cold and very clear around them, and they were standing close enough that he could see her breath in the air. It is necessary, he said, and it was brave. And I should have said that this morning instead of what I actually said. You were surprised, she said, echoing his own earlier excuse back to him with a slight smile. I was surprised and rude, he said. You already gave me credit for the distinction. I am not sure I earned it. She was smiling now, genuinely, and it transformed her face into something that made it very difficult for Phineas to maintain his characteristic reserve. You are earning it now, she said. They stood for another moment in the cold, moonlit night. Then she said she needed to ride home before the temperature dropped further, and he said he would see her in the morning, and she walked to her horse, and he watched her go, and he stood in his field for a long time after she was gone, looking up at the stars. The third day began before dawn. Phineas was out in the field before any of the others arrived, working in the gray pre-dawn light with a hand scythe in the sections too narrow for the team. He had not slept much. He had lain in his bed, going through the conversation by the fence post the way you go through something that you want to understand fully, examining each piece of it. He had arrived at several conclusions that made sleep impossible. She arrived first, before any of the other families. He heard her horse and looked up, and she was riding in from the west road, and she had brought, improbably, 2 tin pots and a small traveling stove, and when she had her horse settled, she had a fire going and coffee ready by the time the first wagons rolled through the gate. You cannot organize an entire harvest community without coffee, she explained to no one in particular, and Clara Hastings, arriving 5 minutes later, said that was the most sensible thing she had heard anyone say all week. The third day had the quality of a thing completing itself. Everyone who came knew what they were doing by now. The sections were clear. The teamwork was established. The Corrigan thresher ran smoothly on its new belt. The Swanson family cut wheat with the efficiency of people who have found a good rhythm and intend to keep it. Carl Peterson, who had returned with apparently no discussion or invitation, turned out to be a remarkably good worker once he had something concrete to do. Thomas Bird and his brother worked the last of the east sections with the same quiet skill they had brought every day, and Phineas made a point of working alongside Thomas Bird for part of the morning, and speaking with him directly about the valley's history in a way he understood he should have been doing for years, not because Maggie had implicitly challenged him to, but because it was the right thing, and he was tired of using the need to survive as an excuse not to do right things. Around midday, the weather changed. The temperature dropped 6 degrees in an hour. The wind shifted from the south to the north, and it had ice in it, the particular sharp ice smell of a system moving faster than predicted. Phineas checked the sky and his stomach tightened. They had perhaps 100 acres remaining. With the full team at their current pace, they needed 4 more hours of good working weather, and the sky was telling him he might have 3. He found Maggie. I see it, she said before he could speak. We need to accelerate, he said. I know. I am going to ask for something that people might not agree to. Tell me. Every available person on the reaper and cutting teams from this point on. No breaks. We rotate water and food to them in the field rather than calling pauses. We push the pace for the last 100 acres, and we finish in 3 hours rather than 4. He looked at her. That is hard going for people who have been working for 3 days. Yes, she said. I know. I am going to ask them anyway, and I am going to make it their choice. No pressure. Anyone who needs to leave can leave. She gathered the teams, and she explained the situation with complete honesty. The weather was moving in. They had 100 acres left. She needed everyone's help for 3 hard hours without stops if they were going to get the full crop in. She said it clearly, and she said it without manipulation, and she said that anyone who needed to rest or leave could do so without any question, and with her full gratitude for everything they had already done. Not one person left. The next 3 hours were the hardest and best 3 hours of collective work Phineas had ever experienced. The cold came in and the wind came in, and people pulled their coats tighter and worked harder, and the reaper went in a continuous grinding roar across the last sections, and the wheat fell and was gathered and threshed and loaded, and the sky went gray, and then gray-purple, and the first scattered flecks of snow began to drift down around 4 in the afternoon. Phineas was driving the team on the last pass of the last field when the snow started. He felt it on his face, cold and real, and he looked up and then looked ahead at the 100 yards of standing wheat still between the reaper and the field's end. He pushed the horses. He came out the other end of that last row with the snow coming down harder and the temperature dropping and 300 acres of wheat safely cut and ready for storage behind him. He pulled the horses to a stop. He sat there for a moment, just sitting, with his hands loose on the reins and the snow settling on his shoulders, and he felt something release in his chest that had been clenched since the night Burl Oaks had ridden through with his news. The harvest was in, all of it. Against every reasonable probability, through the combined will of people he mostly had not known he could count on, it was done. He heard a sound from the edge of the field and looked over. The workers had gathered. When they saw the reaper come out of the last row, someone had started to call out, and the calling spread. And now 20 people were standing at the field's edge in the falling snow, making the joyful noise of people who have accomplished something genuinely difficult together. Phineas climbed down from the reaper. He looked for Maggie in the crowd and found her immediately, because she was the center that everything organized around, because she had been the force that made all of this possible, because he now understood with complete clarity that he had been watching for her since the first morning she appeared at the edge of his field in her red coat. She was looking at him across the 20 feet of snowy ground between them. She had snowflakes on her hair, and her cheeks were flushed with cold, and her green eyes were bright with something that looked like relief and satisfaction and something else, something that she was trying to keep contained, and she was not entirely succeeding. He crossed the 20 feet. He stopped in front of her. He said, "I do not have the right words for what I owe you." "You do not owe me anything," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "You saved my harvest," he said. "You organized 14 families and 3 days of work and a replacement belt and a thresher repair and Carl Peterson, which I am still not entirely sure how you managed, and you did it for a man who told you this morning that you had no right to be here. 3 days ago," she said. "You said that 3 days ago. You have been different since." "I have been trying to be," he said. "I have been trying to be the kind of man who can accept what you did for what it was." She looked at him very steadily. The snow was falling around them, and behind them the workers were talking and loading wagons, and the ordinary business of dispersal was beginning, and they were standing in the middle of all of it in a bubble of strange quiet. "What was it?" she asked. "What do you think it was?" He thought about lying. He thought about saying something safe and practical about community and mutual aid. Then he looked at her face and decided that she deserved the truth and that he was, possibly for the first time in his adult life, brave enough to offer it. "I think it was you seeing something in me that I was not showing anyone," he said. "I think it was you deciding that I mattered enough to refuse to let me lose what I built. I think it was personal, Maggie, for both of us. And I think we should have dinner." She blinked. Then she laughed, and the laugh was sudden and genuine, and it broke the tension that had been holding in the air between them, and she said, "Dinner." "Unless I am wrong about the personal part," he said. "In which case I apologize and we pretend this conversation happened in a different way." "You are not wrong about the personal part," she said. Around them the snow fell, and the workers called good night to each other, and the oil lamps began to appear on wagons heading home. and Phineas Talbot and Maggie Redmond stood in the last field of the ingathered harvest with snow in their hair, and looked at each other like people who have been circling the same truth for a long time, and have finally decided to stop being careful about it. Dinner was the following Saturday evening, at Phineas's house, which he cleaned with more thoroughness than it had received since the summer, and Maggie rode over from her farm at 6 o'clock in the dark with a covered dish of apple cake that she had made because she needed something to do with her hands while she thought about what she was doing. She had been thinking about it quite a lot. She was not a woman who moved quickly toward men. She had the specific caution of someone who has been hurt in a deliberate and particular way, and while she had been clear with herself that Daniel Forsyth was the problem and not men in general, the caution had wired itself into her in a way she could not entirely override. She trusted her instincts. She trusted the fence post in the dark, and she trusted the way he had looked at Thomas Bird, and she trusted the conversation in the snow. She did not trust the general category of romantic optimism, but she trusted evidence, and Phineas Talbot was building a case. He had cooked a proper meal. This surprised her. He had made venison stew and cornbread and had somehow produced a small jar of pickled beets from somewhere, and the table was set with the particular careful formality of a man who does not entertain often and has put genuine effort into the preparations. She sat down and looked at the table and felt something soften in her that had been held tight for a long time. "You cooked," she said. "I can cook," he said, with a slight defensive edge that made her smile. "I know," she said. "I meant it as a compliment. They ate, they talked. Talked in the way that happens between two intelligent people who have been curious about each other for months and are finally in a room with time to be curious properly. She told him about Missouri and the schoolteacher father and the way she had come west. She did not tell him about Daniel Forsyth. Not yet. That was a conversation for later, if there was a later, if the thing building between them tonight became what she thought it might become. He told her about coming to Montana with $160. He told her about the 2 failed crops, the flooding and the late planting, without the minimizing deflection he usually used for those stories. He told her about the 3rd crop coming in and what it had felt like. He told her about his father in a way that was more honest than anything he had said about his father to another human being in 20 years. He was not a cruel man, Phineas said. He was simply a man who believed that the world was hostile and that the only defense against it was to never show need. I think he was afraid, most of his life. I think he taught me his fear because it was the only thing he had to give." "And do you still have it?" Maggie asked. "The fear." He considered this. "Less since Thursday," he said. She looked at him, he looked back at her. The lamp was low between them and the fire had burned to steady coals, and outside the snow that had started with the harvest was still falling quietly on the world, covering everything in a silence that felt like an ending and a beginning at the same time. "I spent 2 days riding across this valley asking people to help you," she said. "I told myself it was community obligation, that it was the right thing to do for the valley, that it had nothing to do with the fact that I have been thinking about you since July." "Since July," he said. "Since my fence," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I rode past that fence 3 times before I stopped," he said. "I kept telling myself it was not my business and kept not being able to keep riding." She smiled. She looked down at the table and then back up at him. "We are both very cautious people," she said. "You are significantly less cautious than I am," he said. "I am cautious in private," she said. "In public I do things like organize the entire valley for a man who told me I had no right to be on his property. I am still working on forgiving myself for saying that. I told you, you were surprised. I was rude. We are not giving me further credit for the distinction." She laughed again, and he loved the sound of it. He had already decided he loved the sound of it in the field, and here in the lamplight at his own table it was even better, warmer and closer and more real. He walked her to her horse when she left, an hour later than she had planned to leave because the conversation had kept being interesting. The snow had stopped and the sky had cleared and the stars were enormous over the valley, the particular brilliant stars of the Montana autumn that come out after a storm and seem closer than they have any right to be. She was putting her foot in the stirrup when he said her name. She paused. "I would like to do this again," he said, "many times. I would like to court you properly if that is something you would accept." She settled back on the ground and turned to look at him. "Court me properly," she said. "I am not young," he said. "I am 31 and I have never been good at this kind of thing and I will probably get it wrong more than once, but I would like to try." She looked at him in the starlight for a long moment. He was a man who had stood in a field 3 days ago barely able to accept help, and here he was now standing in the snow asking for something he wanted with both hands, and the distance between those two things was significant, and she felt the significance of it somewhere deep in her chest. "Yes," she said. "I would accept that," he smiled. It was not the careful, controlled smile of the public Phineas Talbot. It was the whole face, the way a man smiles when something he was afraid might not happen has just happened. She rode home through the cold starlit night with her heart doing something unsteady and wonderful that she had not felt in years. The courtship that followed was, by the standards of Millhaven, Montana in the autumn and winter of 1887, unusually diligent. Phineas Talbot came to call on Maggie Redmond every Sunday, without exception. He helped her with the final work on her winter garden stores. He repaired her root cellar door, which had a warped frame that had been letting in cold air. She taught him how she organized her preserve inventory system, which was significantly more sophisticated than his, and he used it to redesign the storage plan for his grain barn. She read to him from the books she had brought from Missouri, history and natural philosophy, and one battered novel by George Eliot that he found, to his own surprise, genuinely moving. He discovered, over the course of many evenings by her fire and his, that she was funnier than he had initially understood. She had a dry, precise wit that she deployed quietly and with perfect timing, and the more comfortable she became with him, the more freely it appeared, until he found himself laughing at things she said more regularly than he had laughed at anything in years. She discovered that he was a genuinely thoughtful man beneath the self-sufficient exterior, that he had opinions about land management and community governance, and the rights of the Crow and Cree communities to the land that had been taken from them that were more progressive than most men in the valley would have offered, and that he held those opinions seriously, and had arrived at them through his own thinking rather than from any social pressure. She found this rare enough to be notable. In November, he told her about the woman in Bozeman. He told her the whole story, the 3 months and the land and the way he had eventually understood that she had never really looked at him as a person. He told her this not as a bid for sympathy, but because he wanted her to understand the specific shape of the wariness she sometimes encountered in him, and she received it the way he had offered it, directly and without drama. She told him about Daniel Forsyth in December, by her fire, with snow coming down outside and the room warm and close. She told him about Kansas City and the trust she had extended and the specific way it had been taken and discarded. She told him what it had cost her. She watched his face as she talked, and she watched something go very still and very serious in him. When she was done, he said, he was a fool. He was ambitious, she said. The two things are not always the same. In this case they were, he said. Anyone who looked at you and saw something useful rather than someone extraordinary was working with significantly impaired judgment. She looked at him across the fire. He was not being smooth. He was being honest, and the distinction was everything. "Thank you," she said. "I am not saying it to be kind," he said. "I am saying it because it is accurate and because I think you know things about yourself correctly in most cases, but in this particular case, you have carried the wrong conclusion for 2 years. She felt something move through her that was very close to tears and which she was entirely unwilling to release in front of him, not because she was ashamed of the feeling but because she needed a moment to understand it first. "You see me very clearly," she said. "I have been paying attention," he said. In January, with the valley buried in snow and the temperature dropping to 30 below some nights. There was a community meeting at the Millhaven schoolhouse about a proposal from a land development company based in Helena to purchase the Eastern Valley parcels for a commercial grain operation. The proposal was framed in terms of economic development and opportunity, but what it actually meant, as Maggie immediately identified from the language in the printed circular, was that 3 homesteading families on the eastern edge of the valley would be pressured into selling land they had legally claimed and built their lives on. She stood up in the schoolhouse and explained this to the assembled community in language so clear and specific that even the men who had come inclined to see the development proposal favorably began to shift in their seats. She had done her research. She had the relevant land law citations. She had talked to a lawyer in Billings through the mail and had his written opinion on the legality of the acquisition methods being proposed. She laid out the hidden mechanisms of the proposal with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. Then she proposed an alternative. A Valley Cooperative Land Association that would create a formal mutual framework for the kinds of communal work they had already been doing informally, that would establish legal protections for member properties and create a collective bargaining position against outside commercial interests. Phineas seconded the motion without waiting a full breath after she finished speaking. He stood up in that schoolhouse and said that he had personal and direct reason to know what this valley looked like when it organized its collective effort, and that Maggie Redmond's proposal was the most sensible thing he had heard in 8 years of living here, and that he would put his name on it without reservation. Thomas Bird put his name on it. Lars Hodgen put his name on it. James Corrigan put his name on it. Carl Peterson, who had not attended a community meeting in 3 years, appeared in the back of the room near the end of the discussion and put his name on it. By the end of the evening, the Cooperative Land Association had the signatures of 22 Valley families. Walking home in the cold afterward, Phineas said, "You prepared for that for weeks." "Since November," she said, "when I first saw the circular. You said nothing about it. I needed to have my research complete before I spoke. Saying the right thing at the wrong time or without sufficient evidence is worse than saying nothing." He thought about this. "You are the most strategically minded person I have ever met," he said. "Is that a compliment?" "Absolutely," he said. She looked up at him in the cold night. He was walking close enough that her shoulder was almost against his arm, and the cold and the dark and the particular intimacy of the night created a feeling of closeness that the proper rules of courtship had not yet permitted in any physical way. He stopped walking. She stopped. "Maggie," he said. She looked at him. He said, "I know we have been at this for 3 months, and I said I would court you properly, and I intend to honor that, but I need to ask you something." "Ask it," she said. "Is this working?" He said, "Are we, as a thing between us, working? Because I have never been good at reading these situations, and I would rather ask awkwardly than assume incorrectly." She looked at him in the blue cold light of the winter night. She thought about the fence post in the dark and the breakfast coffee, and the way he had stood up in that schoolhouse without a moment's hesitation, and the conversation in December by her fire. She thought about how she had not been afraid, not once in 3 months. She thought about what it meant to be seen clearly by someone and to find the experience not terrifying but simply, finally, restful. "It is very much working," she said. He kissed her then in the winter street outside the Millhaven schoolhouse, very carefully, with the cold around them and the stars above them, and it was the right kind of kiss, the kind that asks rather than assumes, that offers rather than takes. She kissed him back with more certainty than she had expected to feel and less reservation than she had been carrying for 2 years, and when they separated there was a silence that held no awkwardness at all. "Good," he said. "Yes," she said. February was hard. The snow was deep, and the cold was relentless, and the isolation of the Montana winter, which Maggie had come to terms with in her first 2 years, was this winter made entirely different by the fact that she had someone to be isolated toward rather than simply alone in. Phineas came on Sundays and sometimes on Thursdays, and twice She rode to his farm when the weather cleared just to eat at his table and be in his particular company, and he looked up from whatever he was doing when she arrived with a gladness he no longer tried to disguise. They talked about the future with increasing frankness as winter deepened. Not in a pressured way, not in the way of people rushing toward a conclusion, but in the natural way of two people who can see clearly that their futures are becoming the same future and who are beginning to plan accordingly. She told him about the improvements she wanted to make to her market garden in the spring. He told her about the section of his east field he was thinking of converting to a different crop rotation to protect the soil. They talked about the Cooperative Land Association and what needed to happen to get it formally registered with the county. In late February, he asked her to marry him. He did it in her kitchen, at her table, on a Thursday evening when she was making bread and he was supposedly reading but was actually watching her and had been working up to this for 2 weeks. He set down his book and said her name, and she looked up and saw his face, and something in her already knew. "I know this is abrupt," he said. "I know by some conventions we have not waited long enough. I know I am not the easiest man in the world to live with, and I have more deep-set habits of self-sufficiency than is probably comfortable. But I am asking, Maggie, I would like you to marry me. I would like to build something with you. Not on my land or your land, but on ours, all of it together. The way things already are, except properly." She had flour on her hands. She did not care. She put her floury hands on his face and she kissed him with the full weight of 2 years of careful hope and 1 winter of having been loved the right way, and she said yes against his mouth before she even fully separated from the kiss. He put his hands over hers where they lay on his face, flour and all, and she could feel him laughing in the way a man laughs when something he desperately wanted has just been given to him. They were married in April of 1888 at the Millhaven Community Church, on a day when the spring had finally broken the winter, and the valley was green and new and full of the exact particular hope that only comes in Montana after a long cold season. The entire community came. Lars Hodgen and his sons, James Corrigan, who cried, which surprised everyone, Thomas Bird and his family, who came because Phineas had specifically and personally asked Thomas to stand with him at the altar as one of his witnesses, which was not a common arrangement in the valley, and which said exactly what Phineas intended it to say about who he had become. Carl Peterson came, which no one had predicted, and stood in the back looking both out of place and unexpectedly moved. Clara Hastings organized the reception with her characteristic thoroughness and produced a wedding meal that people talked about for the rest of the year. Maggie wore her best dress, a deep green that matched her eyes, and she walked down the aisle of the little church under the gaze of the valley she had organized and the man she had organized it for, and she felt no fear. She felt the specific, clean certainty of a decision made with full knowledge by a woman who had spent years learning what she needed, and who had found it in the last place she had expected, on an October morning in a frost-threatened wheat field in Montana. They joined their lands. The paperwork was filed that spring with the county, consolidating the Talbot homestead and the Redmond claim into a single property of 360 acres that stretched from the eastern slope down to the river road. They divided the labor the way all effective partnerships divide labor, not equally but according to ability and interest, with Maggie running the expanded market garden and the cooperative provisions operation she developed from her original network, and Phineas managing the wheat fields and the livestock and the machinery. The Cooperative Land Association Maggie had proposed in January was formally registered with Millhaven County in May of 1888. It had 24 member families by the end of its first year. The Helena Development Company sent a second representative to the valley in June, and this time when he came to the Millhaven General Store with his printed circulars, he found himself sitting across from Maggie Redmond Talbot with her notebook and her legal citations and the signed membership list of 24 valley families, and he went back to Helena with very little to show for the trip. In the spring of 1889, Maggie had a son. They named him William, after Maggie's father. He was born on a May morning when the apple trees that Phineas had planted along the south fence were just coming into flower, and he arrived in the world with strong lungs and dark hair, and the particular air of a person who has arrived into a situation that is entirely prepared for them. Phineas held his son for the first time with a look on his face that Maggie would remember clearly for the rest of her life. A man who had built an entire identity around self-sufficiency, holding something small and dependent that he clearly already loved beyond any capacity for pretense. "He has your eyes," Phineas said. "He has your stubbornness," she said, from the bed, tired and entirely happy. "He has my stubbornness from 3 minutes old. He has had it since February," she said. "He would not cooperate with any of the positions the midwife recommended." Phineas laughed that genuine laugh she loved and held his son more carefully and said, very quietly, to the baby, "Your mother is funnier than anyone in this valley is prepared for." William was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Clara, after Clara Hastings, who had the auburn hair of her mother and the deliberate temperament of her father, and who learned to walk at 9 months and has not stopped moving with purpose since. After Clara came another son, James, who was named in part for James Corrigan, who by that point had become one of Phineas's closest friends in the valley, and who accepted the honor with visible and only partially hidden emotion. The Cooperative Land Association grew. By 1893, it had 31 member families and had successfully negotiated 2 land defense cases and established a community mill that reduced the cost of grain processing for every farmer in the valley. Maggie ran the operations board with the same combination of strategic clarity and practical warmth that had organized a harvest in 3 days, and she was known across Millhaven County, not just as a farmer, but as the woman who had built the framework that made the valley a genuine community rather than a collection of isolated homesteads. Thomas Bird was elected to the association's governing board in 1892, the first member of the Cree community to hold a formal leadership position in any Millhaven institution. Phineas had proposed him. Maggie had seconded and organized the support for the motion. The vote had not been unanimous, which was a real thing that happened in real communities, but it had carried, and Thomas Bird had served with the quiet excellence of a man who has been doing the work all along and simply needed the formal recognition to catch up. Phineas changed over those years, not in any dramatic reversal, not in the way of stories where a man is transformed into something entirely different. He changed in the way of genuine growth, slowly and with occasional resistance, and with the clear direction of a man who knows what he is working toward. He became better at saying what he felt. He became better at accepting what the people he loved offered him. He became better at asking for things without the asking costing him a piece of himself, because Maggie had demonstrated with great patience and consistency over years that the asking was not failure, that it was the opposite of failure, that it was how people became something larger than what they were alone. The farm grew into something beautiful over those years. The wheat fields managed with the rotation system they had developed together. The market garden expanding each spring into new sections, supplying not just Millhaven, but the communities north toward Billings with preserved and fresh produce through the cooperative distribution network Maggie had built from the original vegetable operation. The south fence line where Phineas had planted apple trees had become a proper orchard by 1893, and in October of that year, Maggie made apple butter and apple jam and dried apple rings and put them up in the cellar alongside the grain and the vegetables and the other evidence of a farm that was not just surviving but flourishing. On the evening of the 6th anniversary of the harvest, October 1893, they stood together on the porch of the house they had expanded together, with young William at 7 years old asleep inside, and Clara at 5 drowsing in the chair by the fire, and baby James at 18 months just barely settled after a complicated evening that had involved a cat, a bucket of water, and several strong opinions expressed in limited vocabulary. The October night was cold and clear, and the valley spread out below them in the blue dark, the lights of other farms visible across the distance, the smoke from other chimneys rising straight up into the still air. 6 years ago tomorrow, Maggie said. I know, Phineas said, you were furious. I was not furious, I was alarmed. You were furious, she said. Your jaw did that thing. What thing? That thing where it goes very still, and that means you are very angry. I was alarmed, he said firmly, and she laughed. They stood together looking out at the valley for a while. His arm was around her shoulders, and she was leaning against him in the particular comfortable way of two people who have been in the same physical space for long enough that the closeness has become its own language. What do you think, he said, after a while, about the 40 acres along the North Creek? She looked up at him. What about them? I was thinking they might convert well to a small orchard, different variety than the south fence. The elevation is slightly different, the frost comes later up there. We might get a longer season. She thought about this. You would need to clear the existing scrub first. That is considerable labor. Lars Hodgen's son Eric has a crew he has been running for land clearing jobs, Phineas said. Reasonable rate, he is good at it. She was quiet for a moment. Also, Phineas said, more carefully, I have been thinking about the proposal Clara Hastings made at the association meeting last month, about a community school that runs through the full year rather than just the summer session. Maggie turned to look at him fully. This was something she had been thinking about for 2 years, something she had been waiting to bring to him because she had wanted to be certain it was the right time and the right framing. You would support that, she said. I would do more than support it, he said. I think we should offer the land for it. There is the parcel at the south edge of the property near the road. Good access from all the valley families. The association could fund the building. We could make a formal proposal at the winter meeting. She looked at him in the cold autumn dark. She thought about the man who had ridden out on a horse 6 years ago and told her she had no right to be on his property. She thought about the distance between that man and this one, and about the fact that the distance had not been achieved through any magic or convenience but through years of daily choosing to open rather than close, choosing to give rather than guard, choosing to be part of something larger than himself, and finding, against every lesson his father had taught him, that the largeness did not diminish him but made him more himself than he had ever been alone. Yes, she said. Yes to the orchard or yes to the school land. Both, she said. Both and everything else. He pulled her closer. Above them the stars were enormous and cold, and the valley spread out in all directions, dark and quiet and full of the lives of 24 families connected by the cooperative Maggie had built from an idea in a notebook on a cold October night. The wheat was in. It had been in for 6 years now, always in before the frost, because they had learned that the harvest was not a solitary thing, and the life they were building was not a solitary thing, and the strength they were building it with was not the false strength of people who refuse to need each other, but the real strength of people who have chosen each other with full knowledge and full honesty, and kept on choosing every day since. Inside the house, young William was dreaming. Clara breathed steadily in her chair by the fire. Little James was down at last, tucked in warm against the Montana night. Phineas kissed Maggie's temple, right where the gray was just starting to thread through the auburn at 33 years old, which she had mentioned once with mild irritation and which he privately found beautiful. Come inside, he said. It is cold. 1 more minute, she said. I want to see the valley. He stood with her for 1 more minute and looked at the valley. It was, he thought, the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. Not because of its beauty, though it was beautiful, because of what lived in it. Because of who had built it. Because 6 years ago, it had been a collection of isolated homesteads full of isolated people holding their needs privately and calling it strength. And now it was something else, something with actual sinew and connection. Because a woman had gotten out her notebook on a cold night and decided that isolation was not the same as strength, and that asking for things was not the same as failing, and that one man's harvest belonged to all of them if they let it. Thomas Bird asked me last week if we wanted to join the spring planting celebration his family does, Phineas said. It is a traditional Cree ceremony for the beginning of the growing season. He said we are welcome. Maggie turned to look at him. What did you say? I said yes, he said. Obviously, she smiled and leaned against him in the dark. We will go, she said. They went inside, the door closed. The fire burned warm inside the house. Outside, the Montana night spread cold and brilliant over the valley, over the harvested fields and the dormant gardens, and the stands of timber on the ridge and the river road running silver in the moonlight, over the 24 farms connected by a network of obligation and care and practical solidarity, over everything that had been built from the specific and unrepeatable combination of her vision and his land, and the decision two careful people had made in October 1887 to stop maintaining safe distances from the things that mattered most. The harvest was in. It had been in every year since. It would be in the year after, and the year after that, because they had built something stronger than any one season, stronger than any frost, stronger than any early cold moving down from the north. They had built it together from the beginning. From the morning she stood in his field in her red coat and pointed him toward his own future, and from the moment he had dismounted and rolled up his sleeves and walked into the work, not knowing yet that the real harvest he was bringing in that October had nothing to do with wheat at all.